Let's jump back in where we left off. I think we were there. Let's go on to, that's okay. Well, we're going to jump to the back page, page 9 on the back of that book. In between where we left off and this page where we're starting, there are a number of examples of deaf culture. We're not going to take time to go into all the examples because we could talk about it for a couple hours. It's kind of fascinating how deaf people do things differently than we as hearing people. So that material is not going to be, you're not going to be tested on any of that, but if it piques your interest, you'd like to know more, those are some great examples, some that we've seen, some that others have shared with us, and it can be a great help to you. I want to talk next about this idea of a deaf culture atmosphere. If we're going to minister to deaf people, how do we make our church a place that they want to be? How do we get things to feel deaf? Okay, now, this is a concept we're most of the time not familiar with because our church is one church and we want everybody to kind of feel they fit. And yet, there are things that each culture does that is kind of different. And deaf people do not fit in the hearing world. I'm going to make a statement. Deaf people cannot become hearing. They think differently. They can learn how we think, but they're going to always be in a foreign culture when they're in our culture. So we have to help them to want to come to church. Most deaf people will not come to a hearing church. That's why you see an interpreted ministry being very small. They just don't. The reason is they don't feel comfortable. And it's not like just, well, I'm not comfortable with that. It's like, no, this is really awkward. Because stuff is happening they do not understand. Because your interpreter is limited. Your interpreter cannot get everything across. We normally think of we as hearing people normally think of a deaf ministry as having an interpreter. We're going to talk about that later, but that is one of the least effective ways to have a deaf ministry. Seriously. Okay, it does not meet the needs of deaf people. So let's talk about this deaf culture atmosphere. How do we create this? Deaf people need to be involved in your church. Get them up praying. Get them taking the offering. Get them singing songs in church. Now, how does a deaf person sing a song in church? Well, somebody's got a voice for it. Okay? You might have a soundtrack that you've recorded ahead of time or prepared ahead of time, one that meets the needs of the standards of the church, or you might have the choir sing and have the deaf people sign for that. And the signing is going to be very different maybe than the words in the song, but it'll portray that same idea. Get deaf people involved in church. They need to feel like it's a place they fit. Another thing that you can do in this deaf culture atmosphere is get as many people in church to know a few signs as possible and meet deaf people. We were in one church, and the church, many people learned sign language in the church. And I told the sign language class on Friday night, or last night of class, I said, Sunday, when deaf people show up, go say hi to them. Tell them your name. Tell them you're glad they're there. And so I said, practice just saying that. You'll be good. And so I was trying to carry on a conversation with this deaf person before church because a lot of deaf ministry happens before church and after church, not during church. Weird concept for us hearing people, but you do more ministry before church and after church. That's why we come to church early. That's why we stay late. So had this, hang on a second, just lost my train of thought. Okay, this one deaf person, thank you. One deaf person, we can do this in sign language, it's really cool. Okay, so this one deaf person was there, and I was trying to communicate with this deaf person. And one person after another came up and said, excuse me, my name, and they spelled their name, they told their sign name, happy to see you. And then they walked off. It was like, oh, okay, thank you, they said. And then the next person. And after about 15 people coming up and doing that, this deaf person said, do all the people in the church here know sign language? Which means, I like this. Okay? Most churches are not interested enough in the deaf ministry to come and say hi to them. Even if you don't know sign language. Now you, college students, you're in preparation for your life and ministry, go say hi to the deaf people. Seriously. Just go up and say, hey, I love you. You know, and now I love you doesn't mean I love you. It means hi. Okay? It can mean everything from, hey, how you doing, to like, let's date. So your facial expression will show that, okay? So don't go, you could be in trouble, okay? So, but you're like, hey, you know, they'll go, oh, hey, that's cool, they know that, you know? And that means welcome, in a sense. That word has 1,000 meanings, okay? So create a deaf culture atmosphere, because people will normally gravitate to the people and places that speak your familiar language. Today I saw your Filipino pastor, and I said, magagandang umaga po. I left off po. Should have said po, but I didn't say po. Okay, magagandang umaga po. And he said, well, good morning to you too. And I was probably not in the right dialect. I don't know. But I was in the Philippines last year, and his face lit up when I said that. Okay, it's just the way it happens. People gravitate toward language and culture. And if we make our church a friendly place for deaf people, where there are signs that say deaf class this way, deaf class this way, where the greeter knows a little bit of sign language and a deaf person shows up, hey, how are you? Just that simple little bit of, hey, come this way, go over here, follow me. And something like that, the deaf person all of a sudden says, I'm at home. And your church ministry can grow. Okay? As far as a deaf culture atmosphere, how do you set this up? There are several good points along this line, and that's on page 10. How do you create a deaf culture atmosphere? I'm going to highlight those. First of all, talk to your pastor about, I need some help with this. We need to make this church a friendly place for deaf people. How can we do this? Talk with your pastor. See. Yeah, we're on page 10, the second paragraph on page 10, how to create a deaf atmosphere, deaf culture atmosphere. Talk to your pastor. When you talk to him, explain what deaf culture is as best you can. Take this book with you and talk about it. Learn a little bit about it. Keep the deaf before your church. We mentioned that. Have a deaf Sunday school class and activities. Let me say this. Most pastors do not realize preaching in hearing church with an interpreter is not the most effective way to minister to deaf people. The deaf Sunday school class is. Because deaf people will learn in their language, at their pace. They can ask questions, which they like to do, relational things. They like to ask questions. They like to tell their stories. They will learn so much more than in the preaching. They learn a little bit in the preaching. They learn with an interpreter. They learn a lot in a deaf class. So you need a deaf Sunday school class. If you're going to minister to deaf people, you need to have a deaf Sunday school class or a deaf Bible class of some sort, whether it's Sunday or whatever day. Create a deaf community in your church. In other words, make them feel at home. We hear a lot about community in the world today, you know, and it takes a village and all that stuff. But seriously, deaf people need to feel at home, part of the church. And they will not feel part of the church unless you make it a purpose in your church. Church leaders and testimonies meet the deaf. In other words, you ought to have a time where somebody from the church, like the pastor, comes in and greets the deaf. There was a group of deaf people that were getting ready to join a church. And they were going to do it as a group because, like I said, deaf people do things together. Their interpreter was joining that church. They were going to join that church. And so they said, well, we need to meet with the pastor. So the pastor was getting all ready for all these doctrinal questions and everything. And it's so funny. When the deaf met with the pastor, they said, okay, I've got a question for you. And the pastor was, okay, here it comes. He said, how many kids do you have? Okay. Where did you go to school? What do you like to do in your free time? Tell me about your wife. And where did y'all meet? And all these things. And they're asking all these relational questions. They weren't asking doctrinal questions. Interesting. Now, these were Baptists. I'm talking about Baptists from an independent Baptist church. They were going to join another church, and they didn't care about the doctrine. They wanted to know all these other things. They wanted to know about the person. That was more important to them than the doctrine. Now, that's a different issue, I realize. Okay. It's a different issue. But it is important to them to know the people in your church. Make it a place for fun. Make it a place for fellowship. Now, you don't have to play games all the time. But make it a place where they're at home to learn. And then notice the last thing up here on the screen. It says, make it a place where they can bring their spiritual problems and their need for help. to you. I mentioned before church and after church being such a valuable time. In our ministry in Trenton, Georgia, we're always having deaf people come in with a letter, and they say, this is from the IRS, or this is from my insurance company, or this is from this, and they say, and they're going to show you a very private letter. And they say, am I in trouble? Is this okay? What do I need to do? And we're constantly asking questions like that, answering questions like that, because they feel comfortable with us. That's really a compliment for them to bring something like that to us. They want help, and they're asking you for advice. They need help navigating this crazy hearing world that they live in. Make it a place when they have a spiritual problem, they can come to you and say, my son, he has anger problems. What do I do? Because a deaf parent hearing children, it's a challenge. Now, the hearing children will probably learn sign language, but they don't have role models because that deaf parent had hearing parents. And they never learned how parents react or should react to children. And so they need your help in the church. When you're ministering to deaf people, you're ministering to a small group of people that has major problems in this world. They need help. And so you say, well, wow, I don't want to have a deaf ministry in my church. That's a lot of work. Well, just read the first pamphlet we gave out and you will change your mind, okay? So deaf culture atmosphere. Get the deaf involved. Now, I want to say this about the atmosphere. A good deaf ministry is not only a good deaf ministry at church, but is involved in the deaf community. Today, but you can't just go down a row of houses and knock on all the deaf doors. They're not all in one spot. You have to go where they go. You have to be where they are. And you can witness to a deaf person in a crowded place. It doesn't matter. They're open to that. They don't care because their language is visual. Other people are going to see, and it's fine. They don't mind that. But if you're going to go visit only deaf houses, you're going to drive 2 hours this way. You're going to drive 30 minutes this way. You're going to drive a half an hour over here, and all day long you're going to go to 6 houses. I know. I've been in this area. I've visited in this area. You're going to go to 6 houses, and 2 of them are home, if you're lucky. Lucky, blessed. Okay. Maybe. So it's a challenge. So the best way to do visitation is to go where deaf people are, at their social events, at the Starbucks coffee gatherings when they get together and drink coffee once a week or once a month, when they go to the mall and they have a fellowship time there. If they have a deaf outing or organization, go be a part of that, because they don't trust you until you do that. It's a weird cultural thing, but you almost don't have the right to win them to Christ until they see that you're real. Okay, now I'm not saying don't witness to deaf people. I'm not saying don't witness to them the first time you see them. But I am saying that they want to see a genuine person genuinely interested in them for you to be able to communicate the gospel and other things with them. So on the back page, now we're to your question here about how to communicate with deaf people. I say back page. Number 11, page 11 down here. Mine's all highlighted, yours is not, but you can highlight as we go. How do you communicate with deaf people? You were asking if you have deaf people in this one little place, how do you communicate with them? They're in the wrong spot. We've got to get rid of them. They've got to be out of here. They can't be here. Or they come to your church and you want to communicate with them. Or you see them in a coffee shop, or you see them in the mall or something and you want to invite them to church. How do you communicate? So here's the ways. First of all, realize that lip reading is very difficult. If you try to say what you say to them, it's going to be hard to understand. Okay? But you can try. Some deaf people will lip read very well, but very few will lip read well. Let me give you an example of lip reading, okay? You have to watch my lips to do this, okay? I go into a coffee shop, I sit down, and the lady brings me some coffee, and then she asks me if I'd like some sugar. And I look up at her eyes and I say, what did I say? I love you. No, I said I'll have 2. See how hard that is? Okay, and I set you up, of course. Okay, but that's I'll have 2 and I love you. Looks exactly the same on the lips, and so it's very, very difficult to understand English language, any language, on the lips for the most part. If you try to speak loudly, it will not help things. Okay, You can speak loudly, okay. They hear you muffled, now they hear you loudly muffled, okay. Speaking loudly does not help, even though people think that does. Also, they don't consider themselves as a handicapped group. It's a communication handicap they have. So realize that to begin with. Okay, so avoid stereotyping them. Then here's how you communicate. First of all, get the deaf person's attention, and you can do that by touching them. You did that by kicking their foot, okay? You got their attention. As a police officer, I can see why you'd kick their foot and not reach down like that, because you could reach down like that and your life could be at risk, okay? You don't know who they are, what they're doing. But normally in church, it's okay to touch deaf people, and you can touch them on the shoulder. Don't throw your arm around them. You'll be in trouble, okay? But tap them on the shoulder is fine. From the shoulder down to about the elbow is fine. Back of the arm, not the front of the arm. Doesn't that sound weird? You have all these rules, okay? But actually, that's what we do. The safest place is on the shoulder. You can tap anybody on the shoulder. A male can tap a female on the shoulder. A female can tap a male. It means nothing except, I need your attention, okay? You can tap them on the shoulder, first of all. Then when you can, I didn't write this one down on the screen here, but number 2, let her be there. Let the deaf person know the subject of the conversation, whatever the subject is. We're talking about, you're sleeping here. You cannot be here. Okay, something like that. Now, you might need to, we're going to give you the other clues here later, but give them the subject when you start talking with them. Deaf people always speak this way. Topic, comment. They're going to tell you what they're talking about, then they're going to tell you about it. By the way, we have any preachers in the group here? Studying to be preachers? Anybody? Okay. That's a good idea with hearing people. Tell them what you're going to talk about, and then talk about it. Okay? The old country preacher said, first I tells them what I was going to tell them, then I tells them what I told them. And it actually works in preaching. Okay, but it works great with deaf. Speak clearly without exaggerating. Do not talk like this. This does not work at all. It's very hard to do, to understand, and it looks weird anyway. Okay, so I think you got gum stuck in the back of your mouth or something. All right, look directly at a deaf person. When you're communicating to deaf people, you have to have their eyes. By the way, in church, when a deaf person looks down, there's no point in continuing. In deaf church, if I say, open your Bible to, and I give a verse, just wait. And when they all look back up, okay, let's go on. In hearing church, you would go nuts if your pastor did that. But we do that in deaf church. It's really awkward for hearing people, but you have to do that because you can't talk if they're not watching you. You've got to have their eye contact. And they need your eye contact. So look directly at them. If you're trying to communicate, even with lip reading or whatever, and you're off to the side and you turn around, they cannot hear you, they can't understand you, they can't see you. They don't know what you're doing. Okay? So look at them. Also, don't obscure your mouth. If you're scratching or something like this, this is really bad. Don't obscure your mouth. They do need to see your mouth. Okay? Don't if you got to sneeze, stop talking while you sneeze, okay? That makes sense. You'd be surprised how many people will just, oh, excuse me, I got to, and they can't hear you. They can't see you. They don't know what's going on. Also, don't stand in front of a light source. Let me illustrate this. I'm going to go over here to the side here. In front of this, now, you just watch them for a period of time. Okay? It's harder to, you cannot look away. You have to stare at me for 10 minutes. It's going to be really complicated for your eyeballs. It's going to hurt your eyeballs eventually because there's a light source. We want to be not in front of a light source, but somewhere where the light comes this direction, but not this direction. Case in point, we were in a church starting a deaf ministry, and the deaf said, ooh, I can't stand this church. I said, why? They said, too many lights. And I looked around, and behind the interpreter, and on this side, and here, and all around the church, they had these beautiful chandeliers with these little tiny lights, and there were way too many lights for the deaf people. It looked like that starry, just like a bunch of stars coming at you. It was too busy. Visually, it was distracting for the deaf people. You say, it's a beautiful church. It was beautiful. It had gold and all this. It's beautiful, but it was very visually distracting, and the deaf could not tolerate it. It's just hard to use. It's like having a microphone that's always like that. And it's just, you just would not want to do that. You wouldn't do that in a hearing church. You'd get the microphone fixed. Well, the lights need to come down. Okay, so don't stand in front of a light source. Maintain eye contact while you're talking. Watch the deaf person when they're talking, and let them watch you. Make sure you maintain good eye contact. Use natural signs as much as possible. Here's an example of something that you can do. You're talking about the two that are laying there. Said, you cannot be here. You have to go over so just very, very natural, big signs, and they may want to talk to you or something like that. But you can do that if you don't know sign language. You can use very natural signs. Or if you're meeting a deaf person in the back of the church and taking the deaf class, just point. Just come here, let's go there. And then I say, okay, here, we're going to go over here. And just point and use natural signs for things. It helps greatly. Repeat or rephrase. If they're reading your lips and they're not understanding you, repeat it. Rephrase it. Change the wording you're using. If you say the same words over and over, it doesn't help, especially if it's a long word or complicated. So change the way you say things. Think creatively. And then be courteous to the deaf person. Realize they are a person. This is a person. This is a person just like you are. And don't assume, here's a big one down at the bottom here, don't assume that a nod means a person understands. Deaf people will go like this to you. They're saying, keep going. I'm sure I'll understand eventually. Keep going. And they're nodding to you. Nodding does not mean they understand. Nodding means, I think I'm catching what you're saying. Keep going. I might eventually get it. Okay? Or something similar. It does not necessarily mean they understand. Now, sometimes I'll go, it looks like they understand. But if they're nodding, they may not. So I cannot tell you the number of times somebody in church has said, I told the deaf person this, and they agreed, and now they did the opposite. Because the deaf person was going like this, they thought they understood, and they did not understand. How many of you like to say, I don't understand? Nobody likes to be the dummy. I've got a dumb question. I'm not going to ask my dumb question. Nobody likes to be the one that everybody points out. Neither do deaf people. They're not going to tell you, I don't understand you. You're stupid. They will be blunt. We were talking about that earlier. John and I were talking how deaf people are very blunt. They'll tell you what they're thinking. If they'll look at you and you were using an example from your country, the Madagascar, they would say, or was that deaf you were talking about, how much you weigh? Both. They look at you and they meet you. You just met the person. Okay, how much you weigh? And we don't do that in our culture. It's like, just don't, especially man to woman. You just don't. In deaf culture, I'll ask a lady, how old are you? And it's fine. Most of the time, unless they've been influenced by hearing people. Most of the time they say, oh, yeah, I look young, don't I? How old do you think I am? And we'll play this little game, and then they'll finally tell me how old they are. It's fine with deaf people. They're very blunt. But don't assume just because they're nodding they understand. Okay? Remember also, we're down under write the message. If you have to write, remember these topics, these thoughts. English is not their first language. It is their second language. English is their second language. That means you cannot use all the words you have in your language. If you use a big word, they probably will not understand it. Okay? We are constantly explaining words because their language is not written. They don't read English well. Think of it that way. How many of you, English is not your first language? Anybody? Yeah, several of you, okay. Is it fun sometimes when people use words that are weird? Okay, and you're like, what do they mean? And you don't want to ask, and so you just kind of nod and okay. And you ask your friend. Okay, well, realize that you don't want to use, that the English is not their first language. Right? Be simple and clear without being condescending. Do not talk down to deaf people. You have to be simple, but talk to adults. Okay, talk to them as if they're an adult. Treat them as if they're an adult. When you cross language barriers, sometimes you have to make your language really simple so it makes you think you're talking to a child. Don't do that. Keep it up there in their language. And then finish your thought. When you're writing something out, finish your thought. We've got a deaf guy that comes to our church. He comes into our office and he'll say, I went to the mechanic and they wrote this. What does this mean? And the mechanic only wrote part of the sentence because he's going like this. He got it, I got it. And so the mechanic stops writing. And so I have to kind of fill in the blanks for him because he didn't put it all on paper. So when you're writing a thought, finish the thought on paper. That way when they go ask their friend can fully explain it. Because I don't know what that part of the engine was. And maybe I have to call the mechanic. What'd you say on this? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. And he had like 3 more things he wanted to say, but the deaf guy was going like this and said, oh, he understands. He didn't understand. That's a bit of the nod thing. But finish your thought on paper. And then the times you want to use an interpreter. Now here, if you're in a situation like we're talking about here, a police officer meeting some people, and it's something that this is just not going to work. We'll call this linguistically complicated. Linguistically complicated situations. When something has to be explained in detail. When something, there's no room for error. This has to take place this way. You need to get an interpreter. You need to get an interpreter. If a deaf person is being arrested, you need to get an interpreter. If a deaf person is being baptized, you need an interpreter. If a deaf person is making a salvation decision, you need an interpreter. It's got to be in their language. Okay? If a deaf person wants to join your church, then you need an interpreter. Okay? Don't just say, okay, yeah, great, this is great, one more person. Don't do that. You need an interpreter for complicated or things that are very specific. If you're giving specific directions, okay, first you're going to do this, then you're going to do this, then you're going to do this, then you're going to do this. You need an interpreter. When a person goes in for a hospital visit, they need an interpreter when they come out. Okay, you've got to take your medicine at this time, you've got to do this, and you've got to do that. If they just put it on paper, it's wrong. And many hospitals will release deaf patients without an interpreter. Well, I wrote it down. It doesn't work. They will mess it up. I mean, okay, very high probability they'll mess it up. English is not their first language. If you're showing a Bible verse to a deaf person and you're trying to witness to them, you probably are going to need an interpreter because they didn't understand that Bible verse very clearly. Even simple verses like, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Short, simple verse. Sign language is very, very helpful here. And then when you know that you're not getting your idea across, use an interpreter. Use an interpreter. Make sure it's clear. Okay, a couple of things. Avoid using phrases like tell him or tell her. Yeah. Speak to the deaf person directly. The interpreter will do his job and tell you the things they're trying to accomplish there. All right. I want to point out one thing on the next page, page 12, and then we're going to move on, and that is let's see, some principles that will help you interpret Bible verses. People ask, how do you interpret Bible verses? Okay, now, I know you're not interpreters, but keep in mind, those of you going into ministry, realize this is what your interpreter is doing in church. Okay? We interpret, number one, for clear understanding. We are interpreting to get the point across, not the words across. You say, well, you're changing God's word. If we signed the words and they didn't understand it, they did not get God's word. We have to sometimes change those words to make it clear in sign language. We change the words into a sign that has the same meaning. Okay? By the way, when you're doing that, you pastors, guys studying for the ministry, you are trusting your interpreter greatly to do that correctly. Make sure your interpreter is qualified to do the job they're put there. Okay? Because it is God's word. It's highly valuable. It cannot be. There's no room for error when we do this. Okay. So number two, keep the speaker's topic clear. Your interpreter does not sign every word you say. They're going to sign the topic and the main points. And number three, make the main points of the verses clear. They're going to make those verses as clear as possible, and realize that deaf people use language that deaf people understand. We've got to change it to their language. There is even something called a certified deaf interpreter. That's a deaf person that interprets. Can you imagine that? A deaf person that interprets to a deaf person. How do they do that? You have a hearing interpreter listening to a message, signing it. A deaf interpreter watches that message and then changes it to a low level or a non-level of language. Changes it into pantomime or gestures. So the whole point is understanding. The key word is understanding. The thing deaf people must do in our churches is understand. Okay. Let's see here. Move on to my slides here. I think I've got that one already. Let's see. Okay. The interpreter's job is to make the message clear, period. Okay. Let's move, I say, back to the very back of the book here, page 17. Page 17. These are some things that were put out by the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf, just to help you understand the culture and language here. And let's see, we're talking about deafness. First paragraph, almost all the way to the bottom. The only manifestation of a hearing problem might be a hearing aid or use of sign language. You probably have seen deaf people in the community here that you did not know were deaf because they don't look deaf. So what does a deaf person look like? They look like a hearing person. You might know it's a hearing aid or a sign language. Sign language is a way that they're attracted a lot of times when people are signing. Deafness is considered a serious handicapping disability or serious handicapping situation or condition because it implies the inability to communicate. In your church, if deaf people seem weird, and we're talking about the culture of deafness here. We're talking about, in our churches, how do we minister to deaf people? We're talking about, why is this a valuable group of people? Why should we minister to them? They are, in many ways, educationally, socially, psychologically, and emotionally messed up because they cannot hear. They couldn't hear their parents. They can't hear the gospel on the radio. They can't hear their pastor. They can't read their Bible. Can you imagine getting up in the morning and not being able to read your devotions? Or if you read your devotions, okay, that's fine, but we're going to read it in Thai, the Thai language. Why? We just pick Thai, okay? We're going to use Thai. Okay, let's use German, something easy, German. You can read your devotions, but read it in German. Okay? You're like, well, you mean I got to learn German first before I can have devotions? Yes. Deaf people have to learn English first before they can read the written word of God. Wow. Or Spanish in Lupita's case. Okay. Also realize, let's go down to the very bottom here, sign language is considered to be the fourth most widely used language in America. You might not realize that, but that's according to Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. Can deaf people speak? Yes, of course. That's on the next page, top of page 18. Can deaf people speak? Yes, they can. Depending on the degree of their hearing loss. Lupita, let me ask you a question. Do you have a voice you can speak good? English or Spanish, which? Both? Okay. Would it be all right? Were you embarrassed if you voice something, some verse, something? Be all right? Did you say that? No? She's not going to do that. Okay. And okay, thank you. All right. Because sometimes it's a little bit embarrassing. They don't want you to hear their voice not being the same. But deaf people can speak depending on their hearing loss or where they, how early it was they lost their hearing, their age, or if they've gone to a good school. Okay? And by the way, most deaf people, even though they can speak, will give that same answer. But a lot of deaf people will not want you to hear their voice. When they get excited, you'll hear their voice. We had one lady in our deaf ministry in Georgia. I had not heard her voice ever. And one day she said something to one of her children. And I went, whoa, she's got a good voice. And she sounded like a hearing person almost. And I went, but she's deaf. I know she's deaf. Did I question she's deaf? No. But most deaf people will not use their voice. Some can. Okay. We already talked about lip reading, and so I'm not going to go into that anymore. Let me see, move on. Can deaf people work? Of course they can. However, deaf people are traditionally underemployed. Big point. Okay, you're talking about your church. You get out in ministry. Your pastor says, or you as the pastor say, okay, let's start a deaf ministry. That'll bring a bunch of people in, and our offerings will go up. No, they won't. Deaf people are traditionally underemployed. So your ministry, your deaf ministry is going to be treated as a missionary ministry, as a bus ministry. Bringing in bus kids, you don't bring them in for their offerings. You don't bring them in for what they can contribute to the church. It's a ministry to them. So keep that in mind. So if I meet a deaf person, what should I do? Not if I meet a deaf person, when I meet a deaf person. There are some things on the bottom of page 18 that you can read and study yourself. Those are important. I would encourage you to read over those before you do anything with a test or a quiz or anything along that line. All right. Let's go into the next book. All right. Any questions on that so far? I know. Are we giving you a lot of information? I hope it's, maybe you know some of this, and I realize that it's a lot. I also realize it's a college and you can handle it. All right? All right, do you need to stand up and stretch? Okay, everybody stand up, please. All right, good. All right, do you know, how many of you are in the music field? You know, anybody in the music field? Nobody in music here. Okay, you've got to learn music, all right? I'm going to teach you some music. All right, now when a guy stands up and does like that, you know what he's doing, don't you? There's actually a meaning to that. When you go down like that, that's beat number 1 of a measure, and then you go across like that, and that's beat number 2, and go across like that is beat number 3, and you go up like that is beat number 4. So let's do this together, all right? You're going to clap when I hit each beat, all right? So here we go. Now, come on, you can do this, all right? Here we go, all right? Yes, you got it. Good, okay. By the way, deaf people don't understand this at all, but that's okay. We hearing people can do it. Yes, that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, y'all have a seat. I just thought that we'd throw that in there. Teaching and ministering to deaf people. You needed something for diversion there. There are 4 kinds of deaf ministries. We talked about this a little earlier. We're going to talk more about ministry now. Not as much about deafness, but about ministry. All right? There are 4 kinds of deaf ministries. I've listed them here. You'll want to highlight each one of those. It is good to be familiar with each kind of deaf ministry. First is an interpreting ministry. An interpreting ministry is when you just simply interpret what happens. The pastor speaks, you interpret. There's a song, you interpret. There's announcements, you interpret. Church is over, you're done. An interpreting ministry basically is when deaf people are there, you interpret. I mentioned before that is one of the least effective deaf ministries, because deaf people have to come into the hearing world for an interpreted ministry. We have begun telling people, you don't have to have an interpreter in your church to have a deaf ministry. Go out where they are. Be where they are. Witness to them there. They'll end up coming to church eventually. You can bring them to church. You can start a deaf Bible study, and deaf people will be a lot more comfortable and will go to the deaf Bible study. In fact, we were down in Temecula, and we were starting a deaf ministry there, and the deaf would not come to church. We could not get the deaf people to come to church. It was terrible. Everything we did, we were out witnessing and soul winning, and we were seeing some fruit, but nobody would come to church. And we said, okay, tell you what, we're going to have a deaf Bible study at this interpreter's house on such and such a day. And we had a crowd of deaf people. It's like, oh, cool. They'll come to that, but they won't come to church. Okay. Still a Bible study, but they just wouldn't come to church. So we had this Bible study for a couple of weeks, several weeks, and we said, you know what? It's crowded here. They said, yeah, it's crowded here. I said, what if we found a different room? And they said, that'd be a great idea. And I said, I know a church that would open their room for us on Wednesday nights. And they said, really? Where is that? And I said, it's the church we're working in. And they said, oh, really? Would they do that? I said, yeah, nice pastor. He'd let you do that. Oh, yeah, let's do that. And so we started on Wednesday nights. We didn't start on Sunday mornings. We started on Wednesday nights, and they all came, oh, this is cool. Wow, this church is nice. They opened this room for us. That's really awesome, And so we met there, and pretty soon we said, y'all ought to come to church on Sunday morning. Oh, they do this on Sunday morning too? Yeah, we do it on Sunday morning. And we started a Sunday school class, and then we went in and interpreted. And we developed the ministry from a Bible study outside, but not from an interpreted ministry. So then the second kind of ministry is what we call a good deaf ministry. And that's where you do have that Sunday school class, where you are ministering to deaf people in their language aside from interpreting. You interpret, yes, but you have outside of that, you have a class as well. Then the other thing is a church within a church. How does that work? I realize that as pastoral students, some of you have been, there are different ideas on this, okay? And a lot of times the idea is don't have a church here that's functioning underneath another church. With deaf people, it tends to work very well if it's done properly. And that is that you have that group meet at a separate time together, and they actually have a church service, but then at other times you will interpret. A couple of experiences here. Our church in Florida, when I first started deaf ministry, and I was back from college as a pastor to the deaf, and our deaf said, can we have a separate service? Can we have a separate service? And I said, well, let's think about it. We talked with the pastor, and he said, yeah, you can do this. And we decided 3 Sundays a month we would be separate. And the 4th Sunday, we would come in and have an interpreted service. We grew that deaf ministry to 40 people. a lot of young people, because they were getting it in their language on Sunday morning. They liked it. It's amazing. And then we would still come in and have an interpreted service. Sunday night was interpreted. Wednesday night was interpreted. In our current church, where we are, that was in Florida. In our current church, what we do is our Sunday services are interpreted, but we have a deaf Sunday school class. Wednesday night is their deaf separate class, and it's deaf chapel, and it's their service. Sometimes we'll have a deaf person preach. We'll have deaf people give announcements. We have a deaf lady that sings and leads songs. Yeah, it's a deaf lady leading songs, but she's doing the special songs, what she's doing. And we don't have as many songs. And then we have preaching, and it's all in sign language, and it's like their separate time. And they function well that way. Okay, that's more of a church within a church. Then there's a separate deaf church where the church actually organizes as a deaf church. And they may meet at a hearing facility, but they're a deaf church. Their offerings are separate. Everything they do is separate. They may pay rent to the hearing church for use of the facilities, or the hearing church may make it available to them to not have to have rent. But a separate deaf church. It is important to understand when you have a separate deaf church that there can be some problems. First of all, you need a bunch of people to make it financially fly. You know they're always asking for offerings in churches. You know why? It's expensive. You do have to think of that side of the ministry. If you have 5 deaf people and say, we want a deaf church, it's not going to work. They can't support their pastor. They can't support the depth of ministry that's needed there. If you have a missionary pastor coming in, then maybe they can do that if they can work out the financial part of it. But often, and we have it written here, that you need about 75 adults, somewhere between 50 and 75 adults, to be able to have a deaf church, separate church. And the reason for that is financial. And to have qualified people to be able to minister to kids. So you need all four. All four are good things, but you can be most effective through that progression. The deaf church can be most effective. All can be effective in their own way. All right. Bottom of page 2. Let's see. I don't see Brother Joseph here yet. So when he comes in, I guess we stop and do chapel. Is that what we do? How does that work? Around 11? Is it? Okay, we got 5 minutes. So, okay, we'll just stop at that point. Hang on just a second. Can deaf people serve God? Of course. However, some crazy thing happened, and everybody thinks that if you know sign language, you're qualified. That's not true. Okay? Oh, this person knows sign language. Okay, they're our interpreter. Make sure they're qualified. Make sure they meet the qualifications of the rest of your church. If a deaf person, oh, you're deaf, you know sign language, you know the Bible, okay, you can preach and teach. They're Pentecostal. We had a guy here last night from the Apostolic Church. He came because we had a deaf speaker using sign language. I mean, I'm just saying. It's not me. He didn't know me. He just knew that they had somebody doing sign language, preaching in sign language, and he said, I'll come. And so just because they know sign language does not mean they're qualified. You've got to be aware of that. Only the Word of God qualifies a person. That will be on your test. All right? The final authority, of course, is the Word of God. And make sure that you do everything you do according to a Bible-believing church fashion. Everything has to be done correctly. Don't make exceptions for your deaf ministry. One pastor asked Brother Camp, the founder of our ministry, he said, I've got this deaf guy, and he's doing this, this, and this. What do I do? He was talking about certain sins he was involved in. And Brother Camp said, well, if he were hearing, what would you do? The pastor said, oh, got it. It's all the same. The Bible's all the same. It doesn't change for deaf people. Sometimes that is as misunderstood. If you have a separate deaf church, realize that separate deaf church must be able to minister to all people. I'll tell you a true story. We were in one deaf church, and they would not count hearing people that showed up. You're hearing, we're not going to count you. Go figure. We were in another deaf church, and I said, what happens to the hearing kids? And they said, oh, they're downstairs watching cartoons. I am not kidding you. This is an independent, fundamental, otherwise Bible-believing Baptist church. I am not kidding you. The kids were downstairs watching cartoons. the hearing kids. That doesn't work. Some deaf person needs to teach those hearing kids, or you need to have a hearing person to teach those hearing kids. Okay? Just the way it is. Just the way it is. Okay, we're going to stop right there.